The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.
This is not Twitter. Government is not the same as Twitter. You can pull Twitter to bits and create a new Twitter. Government can make a serious mistake that can have huge repercussions down the line.
Money makes a world go round. It makes a world go round. Money makes a world go round. It makes a world go round.
Welcome to The Laundry, the podcast connecting AML compliance and financial crime to the real world. We know the Trump presidency throws out a new dramatic storyline every day, and we're all struggling to keep up.
My fellow Americans,
Donald Trump is corruption in the flesh.
we're not doing well. Let me call the Russians to help. Russia.
I'm really rich.
I'm really smart. I like China. Nobody can do that like me.
It is time to drain the swamp.
I love the poorly educated.
That call was perfect. It couldn't have been nicer.
Look how great my hair looks. You're fired.
I'm Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
We're recording this on the 5th of March, so who knows what's going to happen in the short time span until we publish this episode. But we're going to take a deep breath and assess three big decisions that are important to those working in our sector. Decision 1. The Department of Justice has halted the enforcement of a US anti-corruption law that bars Americans from bribing foreign government officials to win business. Decision 2. Attorney General Pam Bondi closed down a unit focused on prosecuting white-collar crime, kleptocrats, as well as tracking foreign efforts to influence US elections. Decision 3. The US Treasury Department announced it will not enforce an AML law that obliges millions of business entities to disclose their identities of the real beneficial owners. I'm your host, Robin Lycka, Solutions Architect at Strise, and in this episode we are asking, has Trump really just legalized bribery and corruption? We'll be discussing how these policies' decisions change the status quo, the impact on AML financial crime and compliance efforts globally, and what comes next on the back of this change in regulation. To dive into this topic, I'm here with Susan Hawley, Executive Director, Spotlight on Corruption, and Peter Geoghegan, Journalist and Director of Democracy for Sale. Welcome back to The Laundry, both of you. Susan, can you remind our listeners briefly about your background and Spotlight on Corruption, please?
Yes, so I've been following anti-corruption enforcement since 2020, so nearly a quarter of a century, which is a little bit scary. And I'm Executive Director of Spotlight on Corruption, which is a UK-based organisation that monitors how the UK enforces and implements its anti-corruption laws.
Thank you. Peter, can you remind our listeners about you, your background, and Democracy for Sale?
Yes, very happy to. Yeah, I'm Peter Geoghegan. I'm an investigative reporter. I've worked and written around issues around corruption, power and influence in Britain and internationally for, best part of 10 years. I wrote a book a few years ago called Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics. I used to be editor-in-chief at Open Democracy, and Democracy for Sale is a newsletter and a new publication, effectively. It's myself and a few former colleagues, which is really all about, as it says in the tin, like kind of corruption and influence in particularly British politics, but internationally as well. So a lot of interest in the kind of developments that we're talking about today. What we've been doing for a long time is like kind of tracking the failures and the challenges of anti-corruption initiatives. But this is the first time we're really trying to deal with the wholesale removal of anti-corruption initiatives. So it's kind of putting all of us, I think, in a new space.
Thanks again for joining me. So let's start by looking at what this new order has changed from the status quo. Susan, how much has the US policy on corruption and bribery set the tone for its Western allies previously?
So look, it's really hard not to overstate. It really was the main driver and the lead enforcer on a range of anti-corruption regulations and global initiatives. So we've got the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention in 1997, which was, really pushed by the US to create a level playing field with their Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We've got the Financial Action Task Force, a global anti-money laundering watchdog created in 1987. And the US has been a major player in setting global standards and really pushing enforcement. And that's a very, very, robust body with a lot of teeth. So, these have been the kind of bedrock of administrations. Enforcement might have gone up and down, but no one's ever questioned before that, these weren't really important. And in terms of actually enforcement, the US has been the global policeman on these issues. So 60% of all foreign bribery enforcement against companies between 1999 and 2021 was done by the US. Last year, 95% of AML fines imposed were, imposed by the US Treasury, and that was over $4 billion. So, and again, on sanctions enforcement, it's been the major enforcer of sanctions, $1.5 billion worth of sanctions breach fines in 2023. So that's the context which, Trump has now come into and is threatening to rip up. And I think that's it's a real moment of crisis for Western allies. Is the US literally going to withdraw from some of these bodies? Is it going to opt out of the conventions? And if so, who's going to defend those global norms on fighting corruption?
Absolutely. And the Biden-Harris administration put the corruption as a core US national security interest. It does really say a lot about what's currently going on, completely revoking that.
Absolutely. And I think, some major tests are coming up for the rest of the international community. Is the UK actually going to try and take on that mantle? The US was like, we're a global leader on anti-corruption. They hosted the UN Convention Against Corruption Conference of State Parties. They really did make a big deal of it, as you say. But, actually, what will these bodies do now? And a really key test of that will be actually next year, because the UK is going to be subject to an anti-money laundering review by the Financial Action Task Force. Now, is the world going to be brave enough to say to a country that has just said it's not going to actually do beneficial ownership transparency, which is a key recommendation of FATF? Is it going to be brave enough to greylist the US because it's actually, breaching the world's anti-money laundering norms? So I think that's a key question facing us. Will these norms hold, or are they going to crumble and give succor to countries like the UAE, which will take it as basically a green light to carry on taking a lot of dirty money?
Yeah, and we'll look more into several of these aspects in the second half of the show as well. Peter, we talked about this in the introduction, but can you give an overview of the big changes that we are now seeing?
I think, one of the biggest changes I think we've seen is the DOJ, the Department of Justice, which is, as it says, halted US anti-corruption law that bars Americans from bribing foreign government officials to win contracts. And that's a big issue. We have similar legislation here in the UK. And actually, interestingly, it's a piece of legislation where there is evidence, I think, is starting to be effective internationally. We saw a big case in Switzerland recently with Trafigura, which was found guilty, and a senior Trafigura executive, English executive, were found guilty of bribing, international bribery. It's the first time in Switzerland, which is a notoriously secretive jurisdiction, had found an entire company guilty of bribery, which shows that this is becoming embedded. We've seen it. We've seen very high-profile court cases with in the UK as well, which actually Susan at Spotlight, Spotlight have done terrific work on keeping abreast of, and they've been difficult cases to win at times, but I think they've really flagged at some level a motivation and a real interest to try and hold companies account for what they're doing internationally. Pulling the rug out from under this is really serious. It's really significant because, as Susan says, the US has been the gold standard, the world leader in a lot of this. It has been, on one hand, yes, there's been lots of aspects of money laundering that comes out of the US. The US is secrecy jurisdictions are real and exist, but the US has been a gold standard, especially in recent years, where you saw not just putting anti-corruption at the heart of government, but also there's so much on democracy. This was also part of it. It was very much part of Biden's pitch on the international rules and norms base. And it's had a big effect in the UK, a lot of this as well. I think you wouldn't have seen David Lammy's talking around kleptocracy and making that a big pitch if it wasn't for the leadership of the US. So I think that's a really significant one. The other big thing, which Sue has also kind of flagged there, is around beneficial ownership. This idea of saying beneficially who owns a company. And the US, the US had brought in new legislation around this, was rolling it out. Secrecy jurisdictions in the US, like the Dakotas and Delaware, were being forced to be more transparent. And this is a really significant thing when it comes to money laundering. You see it time and again. And it will have a big effect on the UK. The UK has got a particular role here, especially with the overseas territories. And one of the things that the UK has been trying to do is get the overseas territories of people like the British Virgin Islands, other territories, the Cayman Islands, to a lesser extent the Isle of Man, the Channel Islands, especially the BVI, actually to change. And it's very hard to kind of make that argument when the United States is rolling back. It's really difficult. That argument was hard enough to make as it stands. So I think it's really significant for a bunch of reasons. Significant globally because the dollar is a global currency. Huge amounts of money laundering take place in dollar denomination, so it's very significant for that reason. But it's also the kind of hegemonic strength of the US in terms of setting rules and norms. So these sort of moves are really, and for a president who's only in office a month to be kind of seemingly targeting these as things that you're going to roll back on. These are not proactive decisions; they're proactively retrograde rather than deciding not to do something. So I think both of these are very significant.
Can I add a couple of things to that? I mean, I think the overseas territories thing is really important because actually 25% of US financial services exports go to those overseas territories. And so you can really see a world in which, the UK is saying, no, you've got to have these open registers, and them saying, sorry, you don't bring us that kind of money. So, we're not going to listen to you. So I think, that's going to set up quite a lot of conflict, actually, and be really problematic for whether the UK can show leadership on it. But I just wanted to flag a couple of other things. I know you wanted to focus on three things, but, we've also got the golden visas. We've got a time where the EU and the UK are closing down golden visa routes and regimes. The Trump administration is saying, we'd welcome Russian oligarchs. They're great guys, and we'll have their investment. This is like a complete about turn. It's really extraordinary. And you've also got, really concerningly in that context, the decision to pause all enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So you've essentially got the US saying, if there's going to be really direct foreign espionage by foreign government, we'll look into it. But anything else like insider operations to influence politics, we're not going to look at that. So there are these other things that are part of the bigger picture about, cracking down on both like hostile state actors trying to use corruption and other techniques to undermine democracies, and they're all having the rug pulled under them as well.
Yeah, it's almost funny that you should mention Delaware. I was just thinking it's almost like a laughingstock with AML analysts, like the operational people. Whenever you see a company from Delaware, you just know that there's nothing there. And this will now be the case. Like, the registries are paramount, not only for transparency, but also operational efficiency. So I have a slight tangent of a hope that commercial forces from the banks will see how much more time they will spend on operational inefficiency with the lack of this transparency, with the lack of registries and data. Let's move on from this. On the subject of the changes to the Corporate Transparency Act, we received the following clip from Scott Graytack, who's the Director of Advocacy at Transparency International, US. Scott had the following to say.
The US Treasury Department's announcement that it will only be enforcing the Corporate Transparency Act in the future with regard to foreign companies who are registered in the United States really misses the mark. To focus on companies that were formed abroad misses the core threat that any anonymous company, regardless of where it's formed, can be abused by criminals. while a foreign company may have an even higher risk, this doesn't in any way speak to the fact that that baseline risk presented by an anonymous company, that's what fueled Congress's decision to pass the Corporate Transparency Act. It did not make a distinction between a foreign-formed company and a U.S.-formed company when it came to whether and to what extent they had to report their beneficial owners. For Treasury to make that distinction now really misses the mark behind the entire law.
That was a really interesting aspect from Scott on the distinction between foreign-owned and U.S.-owned companies being minimal. But if we look at the closure of the kleptocracy unit, on day one of her new job, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi shut down the special unit focusing on seizing Russian oligarchs' assets. Peter, what does this say on what we can expect moving forward?
I think it's quite a remarkable thing. If you just stand backwards and just, kind of take away some of the kind of the nuts and bolts, say, of the financial institutions underpin this and all the rest of it. You look at it and go, you have got the new US Attorney General who makes it a priority to get rid of the kleptocracy unit. This is saying openly, and I think the political context of this is important. This is a political context where Ukraine is the most important political issue that the world has at the moment. The Russian war economy has been, the relationship between the oligarchs and Putin is well documented and actually pivotal to the Russian war economy. And we've seen very few oligarchs break ranks with Putin since 2023 as well. So these are all really significant constellation of things that are happening. And I think it's incredibly significant. It's significant from a nuts and bolts, raising money. This has been a successful unit. It's raised more than 700 million in assets from Russian enablers, charged more than 70 individuals. That's all significant. That all has a real crime aspect to it, financial crime aspect to it. But the politics of this, I think, is even more significant. It is saying domestically, but actually crucially internationally, and crucially to Russia, you can do what you want. You can be involved in international money laundering. That is not an issue. The quiet part is really loud now. And I think that was what was so significant about that move. I felt like Pam Bondi's move was on one level very significant on a nuts and bolts level for fighting financial crime, but politically even more salient, because it says we are now entering a world where kleptocracy is okay. Kleptocracy is not a problem. We do not think kleptocracy is a problem. And we have no intention of trying to limit kleptocracy. And I think that's a message it's intentional. I don't think this is a byproduct of doing this. I don't think this is a government efficiency move. I think this is a political message from a political leader who does not have any issue with kleptocracy. And frankly, who's made most of his money, lots of questions about his own money in terms of his success, in one of the most corrupted parts of any political system, which is real estate. We see this, whether it's in the UK or anywhere else. Real estate has long been a vehicle for money laundering. Often when it comes to political donations and questionable donations and looking for favours, real estate is top of the list. We have someone who comes from that world who I think probably the most benign reading sees financial misfeasance as part of greasing the wheels of getting things done. And that's the most benign reading.
Can I broaden this out a bit beyond Russia as well about the impact? Because, obviously Russia is the key issue of the day. But if you look at what some of those units did, particularly the kleptocracy unit in the DOJ, they went after widespread looting in Malaysia in the 1MDB case, assets which Sania Bacha stole from Nigeria, which ended up in the UK, have been frozen, not by the UK, but by the DOJ. So they're held by the DOJ. So, that unit also got money off Equatorial Guinea's dictator, Obiang. I mean, this is going to have huge repercussions across the world, because it's not just being open doors to Russia. It's basically going to, empower brazen kleptocrats around the world, which is really a disaster for democracy.
Yeah, I find it interesting as well that they have their reasoning behind this, but it's almost like, the smoke screen of we're going to go after the cartels, but nobody's questioning okay, so we can have kleptocrats or cartels, but we can't fight both. But do you think this was signposted in Trump's rhetoric, or could we see something from his previous time in the White House signaling this?
So I think it's a really interesting question, because I think there was a lot of complacency before Trump came into power, because people thought, Actually, last time it wasn't that bad. Like he didn't like the FCPA, but actually FCPA enforcement kind of was a bumper year in 2019, his last year in office. I mean, there were some signs that, enforcement went down in other areas, like corporate prosecutions dropped. But, there wasn't like a sense that, it was a complete disaster. So I think this is a new administration. And I think it is worse than the worst case scenario. I think if you look at Project 2025, which Trump distanced himself from during the campaign, he's actually tracking that quite closely, but going even further if you look at what they've done with the US aid. So this might not be the end of it. We might also be looking at, they're going to review all the AML rules to see if they're a burden on business. They've got a very extreme deregulatory agenda. At the same time, they've got an agenda to essentially gut public bodies. So where does that leave regulators? Who's going to be enforcing that? So I think it's much, much more extreme. And I think maybe, the world wasn't quite aware of how extreme it was going to be. But actually, people who were warning about Project 2025 were right. That if, the most chilling bit in it for me is that all litigation decisions in the DOJ should be subject to the president's agenda. And that is the most extraordinary accrual of power to the president of the United States and allows the weaponization of the justice system.
Interesting times ahead would be understating it, to say the least. Yeah. But we've covered a lot here. We'll be right back to talk about what this means for the compliance sector and financial crime fighters, as well as what comes next. We'll be right back.
Strise turns KYB from a costly burden into an automated winner. But don't just take my word for it. Let's hear what one of Europe's largest payment companies, Vipps Mobile Pay, has to say.
In the olden days, there were people sitting there Googling the company name, all the brand names, the CEO and so on. I think they used more effort into the process than evaluating the outcome, and that's what I'm looking for. I would say Strise definitely helped us improve our productivity. So working more efficiently, working more risk-based, automating repetitive processes, and by this helping us, of course, to decrease costs, but also improve customer satisfaction. Being able to make low-risk decisions automated without long waiting times, that's of course extremely important. Strise, one tool that works in all our markets, that we are able to collaborate, to have streamlined processes, to have optimized processes, to have one tool, one source of truth that is collecting all the input from a lot of other sources, so you don't need to open 3 different tools, but everything consolidated in one place. Either you are part of the scalable automation game and work risk-based as everyone else, or you will not survive the competition. Strise is really helping us realizing those ambitions and goals.
Explore the AML Automation Cloud. Visit strise.ai for more information.
Okay, having looked at how things have changed pretty dramatically under this new Trump administration, let's move the chat on to what comes next. Peter, how significant is the divide in policy that we're going to see between the UK and the EU and the US administration?
Potentially, I think it's very significant in this area. I think and it mirrors, I think, the wider political. I think, my kind of sense is it's unlikely from what we've seen around anti-money laundering, anti-corruption. As Sue says, I think you need to see it within the context of a broader politics. This is the politics of Project 2025. I think it is a politics that there was a massive underestimation of what people didn't believe what Trump was saying, I think, frankly, ahead of the 2024 election. I couldn't really understand why. He'd been pretty obvious about it, and he'd been pretty obvious about what he saw as his mistakes, which was listening to people. The first term, he did listen to the Rex Tillersons of this world, the kind of corporate titans of America, who were very old-school corporate titans. They believed his politics, old-school Republicans. He's now surrounded by the Elon Musks, who are much more kind of what you might call accelerationists. This is the Peter Thiel version of the world. This is the move fast and break things world. This is the world of Silicon Valley, not the world of Wall Street. And I think that's been the big shift that we're seeing. The UK, I think, is still in this uncertain role with this because we currently kind of float in the middle of the Atlantic between the US and the European Union on a lot of issues. We're much closer, I think, increasingly because of what Trump is doing to Europe, because of our commitment to kind of a rules-based order. It's quite clear that's where Keir Starmer sits. We've not seen any significant change to, say, the anti-kleptocracy drive from David Lammy, all that, that talk about lots of world-leading talk. But we've seen, I think that in some respects hasn't shifted. It'll be interesting to see. The language, at least, hasn't shifted. Whether we're going to see in a world of talk about rearmament, whether anti-corruption will still be seen as part of something that the government sees as significant enough is kind of TBC. But I think you're also going to see in Europe, being on the other side of Trump, I think for Europe in particular will be part of how it sells itself. I would be surprised if you're going to see at the European Commission level or the European Union level a change on some of these areas. So I think it's going to be quite choppy. I think you can't see any other way around it. I could see, Europe still has its issues. The European Commission, for example, they're very untransparent organizations themselves. Trying to get information out of Europe is very hard. We still have secrecy jurisdictions in Europe as well. Europe also has real challenges by having, frankly, autocratic states within it. I'm thinking primarily of Hungary and Slovakia, who've already shown their ability to be blockers. I think that's where European leaders want to get to. That's where Emmanuel Macron, I think, wants to get to. They would happily like to see if the US cedes this territory, that Europe can set itself up as the guarantor of the rules-based world order. But one of the critiques of the Vance Trump world of Europe is correct in terms of it is split, it's riven, and the consensus model does often end up with the lowest common denominator, which for all those other factors can actually end up being not as robust, especially around these issues. Whereas Europe's been really strong, say, on digital rights, far beyond the US, far stronger with the Digital Services Act, which is one of the reasons the Musks and Zuckerbergs of this world really hate Europe. When it comes to anti-corruption, actually, it has been the US leading the way. So I think that's where it is. What is going to fill this lacuna, this gap, is still TBC.
And Susan, do you think that companies will be needing completely different frameworks for working in the US and Europe? Will it be like corruption and bribery is fine in the US? Or will it change how companies expand globally and potentially put themselves at risk?
I think inevitably it's going to change the risk-profit calculation in companies. Everyone has always said the only people that companies are really scared of, and this means European companies too, is the US. And the US was a very proactive enforcer of foreign companies, the most proactive enforcer. So I think a lot of companies will be holding out now to wait and see. You see a lot of law firms saying you shouldn't be complacent, you should still keep up with your compliance obligations, and people kind of grasping at a silver lining that, this is only for 5 years. But we don't know that. And we also know that, bringing a case to court where a company can say, but the administration clearly said this wasn't going to be enforced, it's not going to fly in a court. So I think now it all depends on how much the UK and some EU partners step up. And the trouble is, as Peter's kind of intimated, actually, is this going to be a priority when you've got to sort out, defending the European boundaries against Russia? Or is this just going to slip down the agenda? So I think, like in an ideal world, at the moment, a lot is resting on political will in the UK and being able to get other allies on board. And we would love to see, institutions like the Serious Fraud Office and the National Crime Agency step up and show, at least they're going to proactively enforce. They're never going to be able to fill the gap, but there is still a risk for companies so that they can't just rest on their laurels.
And what about the anti-corruption and anti-bribery efforts? How interlinked are they with anti-money laundering?
I would say, they're absolutely integral. You can't really separate them. And I think, that's why FATF and the OECD are such key players in this, and what happens to them, and what the US's decision is about whether it's going to withdraw. It might withdraw funding, for instance, like 20% of the OECD's funding comes from the US government. That's actually a big proportion. We know the funding's been going down already. That would impact on whether it can actually monitor whether all countries are implementing the Anti-Bribery Convention. So I think there's some wait and see actually here? Like, how bad is it going to get worse? And at the moment, we can't predict that it's not going to.
Peter, do you think it's going to get better or worse working in compliance the next couple of years?
Am I the only one who feels like it's been about 4-year term already? And I think we're about 6 weeks in. So I'm kind of generally, I'm avoiding prognostications about the future. It's hard. The one thing you can say is, I think what we can do is look at when does the Trump administration change tack? So it changes tack, but there seems to be a few there seems to be a few pinch points that actually do force the Trump administration to change tack. One is the bond market and the stock market. That definitely is something that Trump is reactive to. The other, I think, is a sense of public wins. If there's something I can win here, and there's a public win here for me. And the other is some forms of external pressure. The challenge, I think, for this whole agenda is it's really hard to see where that fits in with any of the things that are pinch points for Trump. The bond market and the stock market are not going to, the equity market are not going to respond to any of these issues. I think it's I'd be very surprised. I don't see that. And the problem, I think, in general is, like, it's hard to see corporate America standing up and going, we really want these things. They've had to be forced into these things. And there's definitely, for some of the banks, I think there is actually advantages for them in it. Are they going to go out to bat for this instead of other issues, which they will have? These are going to be institutions with a host of things are going to be trying to lobby for change on, or at least to water down some of the worst of things that are happening. And I think the challenge and the struggle to see any change with this is that it's hard to see who amongst the kind of people that Trump respects and listens to. He respects authoritarian strongmen. Authoritarian strongmen hate this stuff, frankly. They absolutely hate it. They despise it. They want to see all of it thrown into the sea. And so that, I think, I'm sorry for being gloomy on it, but I'm struggling to see, say from a comms perspective even, where you're going to kind of fight that battle in a way that's going to get through to somebody like Trump.
10 out of 10 times when we talk about this, it does get gloomy.
But there is a silver lining if actually compliance staff are able to make a case, including to governments, like, actually this stuff matters and we want it. And I think they play a really important role in that. And just to give you an example, back in 2016, the UK government, it was just after the Conservative government had got a full majority, and someone said, let's rip up the Bribery Act, and they went out to business and they did a consultation and said, yeah, what do you think? Shall we, weaken the Bribery Act? And almost the one exception was the Small Business Federation, but all of the big companies, including the big defense companies, were like, are you kidding? Actually, the cost of dismantling these compliance requirements is actually quite huge. I also think it slightly happens with what happens with the economy, because we know that people cut back, on compliance when there's an economic downturn. Maybe if there's a big boom and some of the kind of boom and bust risks emerge, companies will see that they need those compliance structures in place to actually, have financial stability. So I'm just trying to give a bit of a silver lining.
Yeah, great point, Susan. So on this, we're talking a lot about the policies and the immediate geopolitics, but what is the real world impact on ordinary people of these decisions?
I think it's a really good question. I think what we can see, one of the reasons why the anti-corruption agenda is important is that corruption does cost. It costs people. It costs people's lives. You see money being siphoned off. Some of the examples there of the kind of things we've seen, say, ending up in London, like the Nigerian case, it was US-led in many respects. This is money that's been pilfered from state coffers. It's money to do with that should be going into public services in some of the poorest parts of the world. It's money that should be, it should be going to tax revenue, et cetera, et cetera. And what it does is feed into, actually, and it has a huge impact in that respect, but also it feeds into wealth inequality, which we can see is also feeding into rising authoritarianism. So it kind of, from a democratic point of view on every level, this really matters. It's one of the things people actually do care about as well if you talk to people. And what I think we might so far have missed in this conversation is, my sense, this is purely anecdotal, is that in the US, Donald Trump's rhetoric of I am clamping down on corruption, which is what he does say too, is effective and working. People are buying the idea that Doge, Elon Musk's efficiency unit, as its Department for Government Efficiency. In reality, we can see that it's actually doing very little, and what it's doing, it seems to be often deleterious. And most of the things it says, it's besides it's cutting of USAID, but it is working with a lot of people. Most folks in the US, 99.9% are not engaged in this conversation that we're having. They know nothing about this. And they listen to what Trump is saying, they listen to what Musk is saying, because the word corruption is used a lot. Musk talked about it with USAID. They talked about, we got all this corruption. And so far they've identified no corruption. They've identified stuff that they politically do not like. So Donald Trump in the address to Congress this week was talking about, he was reading out things, and there were things he didn't like. $40 million for, Burmese diversity in Burma, things like that. They're not corruption. They're political things he doesn't like. And it's a small fraction of what USAID does. But that sticks. That narrative, I think, has stuck. And I think if we think about a bit of a ray of hope or something that could be done, I think that's which was much more likely to be successful, is trying to work on that perception and trying to change people's perception about what has actually been done. And that idea that this is tackling corruption and corruption has been tackled. Whereas the other thing, actually what's happened is the opposite. I think there's a space there. I think the space to get this government to change its policies from a kind of behind the scenes lobbying just doesn't exist. But the space to get the public to care about these issues and go, actually, do you know what? This isn't tackling anti-corruption. This isn't making my life better. It's making it worse. And just to kind of labour that point a little bit, one area I think this is very significant is fraud. Personal fraud is a real issue. Scams are a real issue. Scams are growing. They are becoming a bigger issue. The Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project where I used to work is a big story out this week, a global story based on leaks to a Swiss media outlet, but has a global footprint about scams from Georgia. Cambodia, something like a half of Cambodia's GDP actually at the moment seems to be has been attributed to scams. So certain countries are being very effective at it, and that is happening internationally. It's having an impact internationally. It's having a big impact in rich countries like the US. So that receding of soft power in places like Cambodia is actually increasing fraud. Fraud is going to be the kind of thing we're going to probably see less as part of all this anti-money laundering failures. Fraud's going to be easier to do. That's the kind of thing that hits people. And I think that's where there is a space to be constructive and to think about how things could be different and how getting these sort of messages out. I think that's more likely to be effective than kind of going, why don't you bring this back? It's really good. It brings more money back. I think bursting that idea that that the Trump administration are tackling corruption, whereas actually they're doing the exact opposite.
Very interesting aspects there. So before we end this episode, we're going to dish out some quick fire questions for you. Are you ready? What recent fin crime policy decisions by the US government is going to have the biggest impact?
I think it's the package, and it's not even one. You weaken corporate transparency, you take away enforcement units. I think the anti-money laundering rule, we still might see more, but this could carry on and get worse, and it's about the package, not just one policy. What would be your message to United States Attorney General Pam Bondi if she happens to be listening to The Laundry? Pam, don't do it. Sorry. Go on, Peter.
I think it's something like that. I would really wish if she was listening to that. That'd be very good. It's very hard because she seems to be quite intent on doing the exact opposite of probably what we think is the right thing to do. And again, I think it's like trying to figure out that appeal. Like, I think it feels like this is all base politics. And I think, my message would almost be, if your voters realise what you're doing and what the impact it will have, that potentially will have negative impacts for you. Because I think that's the only thing that's going to really work. They don't seem to have any interest in saying this will lead to more kleptocracy around the world. That as a pitch doesn't seem to work. So I think it's a base political pitch, and this is not popular. If people knew you were actually doing this, they would not like it. 4 years is a long time, and there's unintended consequences that might start to pop out where something happens, and the reason it happened is because of exactly this, and that is a danger. That's always a danger with doing stuff like this. Government isn't not the same as Twitter. You can pull Twitter to bits and create a new Twitter. Government can do something, make a serious mistake that can have huge repercussions down the line.
You're so passionate about this. It's quick fire. We said quick fire questions.
I apologize.
Should we just use the last quote there to Pam? This is not Twitter, Pam. Yeah. Why should the average compliance professional care about corruption?
It hurts the bottom line, and it creates bad, rotten cultures internally.
And do you think that Trump has just legalized bribery and corruption?
Yes.
And with that, that brings this spin of the laundry to an end. Susan and Peter, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people find and connect with you?
You can find me, Democracy for Sale. The Democracy for Sale Substack is mainly where you'll find us, where you'll be getting lots of newsletters about all the kind of the investigations we do, as well as excellent comment analysis pieces by people like Sue. So that's on Substack, Democracy for Sale.
And we are on spotlightcorruption.org is our website. We're on LinkedIn and we're on Blue Sky. And I'm on both too personally, so look us up.
Money makes the world go round.
Thank you all for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, check out the back catalogue of more than 100 episodes and follow The Laundry on your podcast platform of choice. We'd love for you to share the podcast on your social media channels. Tell your colleagues about it. Give us a 5-star rating. It really helps people to find us. What subjects do you think we should be talking about? Comment on the Strise LinkedIn, my LinkedIn, or email laundry@strise.ai. Your host for this episode was me, Robin. The producer was Matthew. Our editor was Dominic. Our engineer was Nicholas. The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud. Visit strise.ai for more information and see you next time. Welcome back to the Laundry.
You were doing so well.
Almost.
You were so close. It was really, I was like, he's almost done it.
The Laundry is proudly produced by Strise, the AML automation cloud.